It was an ordinary evening. My wife and I were going through the motions of everyday life. Laundry, making sure our child was tucked in, preparing for another quiet night in the condo we had called home for the past few years. I was folding clothes, trying to block out the usual hum of my thoughts. Life had settled into a rhythm, one that should have felt safe. But that evening, as I turned my back to grab another shirt, I heard her voice. "Hey, the attic door's open." At first, I didn't understand. The door to the attic was small, tucked away in the master bedroom's walk-in closet, a detail that had always seemed more out of place than anything else. It was a door we never really used. The entrance was so narrow, no one had any reason to go up there. But her tone, almost startled, caught my attention. I glanced over at her, noticing the furrow in her brow. "Are you sure?" I asked, not quite able to hide the knot of discomfort forming in my stomach. I had always been uneasy about that attic. Maybe it was because it seemed too small, too hidden, or maybe it was just the silence of the room when we passed by it, a silence that felt wrong. She nodded, stepping closer to show me. The door, which had always been flush against the wall, was slightly ajar. Not much, just enough to catch the light from the hallway, but it was enough to make my heart race. We were careful, cautious. The thought of an intruder made us both uneasy. The possibility of someone sneaking through that tiny opening made my stomach turn. My wife immediately grabbed the phone, dialing 911. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at that small, ominous door, feeling as if it had somehow gotten bigger in the last few minutes, stretching across the room, its edges dark and unfathomable. The shadows it cast seemed alive. While we waited for the police, my mind began to drift back to other places, other times. My childhood home, to be specific. The memories came rushing back in fragments, like flashes of something I couldn't quite grasp. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, the ever-present chill in the basement, and of course the attic. I had forgotten so much about that house. The smell of old wood, the creak of the floorboards. But the attic was impossible to forget. I was snapped back to the present when the police arrived. 2 officers, polite but impassive, scanned the room, their eyes landing on the door. One of them knelt to inspect it, shining a flashlight around the edges. "There's no sign of forced entry," he said after a few moments. My wife and I exchanged a look. What did that even mean? It was still open. Still wrong. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone hiding in the attic. After a cursory search, they reassured us it was likely nothing to worry about. "Maybe it just came loose," one officer suggested with a shrug. The other nodded, his face unreadable. But none of their explanations eased the feeling of dread building in my chest. Something didn't add up. And yet, here we were, left with nothing but questions. I thought of the cold attic of my childhood home, the one that never quite felt empty. Maybe it was just me, but the unease never really went away. Even now, standing in this condo, it felt like it was all connected somehow, like the door had been left open on purpose. As they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness inside that small attic wasn't just physical. It was something else, something far older, something that had followed me from my childhood. I glanced over at my wife, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing. We both knew this wasn't just about a door. This was about something much deeper, something that neither of us could quite explain. I try not to think about the old house too often, but the events of that evening, the open attic door in the condo, made it impossible to keep those memories buried. I hadn't thought about the house in years, not until that moment. The house, a relic from the 1960s, stood at the edge of the neighborhood, crumbling in ways I didn't fully understand as a child. It was large, too large for a family of 6, but there was something about it that always felt off. I remember the basement, the smell of old wood and dampness, how the air was thick down there, as if it didn't want to be disturbed. But it was the attic that always haunted me the most. The memories of that house were laced with a constant unease, an almost physical weight in the air. There was a strange aura about the attic, a feeling I couldn't shake even during the daytime. As a kid, I would stand at the bottom of the stairs leading up to it, staring at the small door tucked into the ceiling, feeling this knot tighten in my stomach. The attic was supposed to be a place for storage, forgotten things, but to me, it was something much worse. It felt like a place that held secrets, something waiting in the shadows. It wasn't just the darkness up there, it was the presence, something unseen but always felt. The rest of the house wasn't much better. The basement, dark and cold, felt like it could swallow you whole if you stood still too long. And then there was the bathroom. It wasn't the most impressive room in the house, but there was this huge cabinet in there, big enough to fit a couple of grown adults inside. I never liked it, never understood why it was so large. I can still picture it clearly, looming over the room like it was part of the house's strange design. Its wooden doors always too heavy, too solid. I'd stare at it, always wondering what could fit behind those doors, what was hidden just out of sight. I didn't want to know. Then there was the hallway. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoed through the narrow space late at night. I would lie awake in my bed, my ears straining, trying to make sense of it. Who was walking in the hallway? Everyone was supposed to be asleep. I would lie there, heart racing, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they never did. They just kept coming, closer and closer. I would try to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It was something else. One night, as I lay in bed, the footsteps started again, but this time something was different. I wasn't sure what made me get up. Maybe it was the way they seemed louder, more deliberate, or maybe it was the feeling of being watched. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my brothers who, as usual, were out late. I had never told them about the footsteps, never mentioned the unease I felt. They wouldn't understand. But that night, something pushed me to get up, to go to my mother's room. I don't know what I expected, but when I reached the hallway, I felt it. Something invisible, something that gripped me, pressing down on my shoulders. I remember being frozen, my body refusing to move, as though my feet were cemented to the floor. The air around me was heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. The footsteps were louder now, right behind me. I tried to call out, but no sound came. I turned, tried to run toward my mother's room, but my legs felt like lead, my body trapped. Something was holding me back, an invisible force that I couldn't escape. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, its coldness, its malice. I could feel it pressing down on me, and I thought I wouldn't make it. In the end, I don't know how I managed to break free. I ran to my mother's room, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. I don't think she ever knew what had happened that night. She just comforted me, held me, and told me everything was fine. But it wasn't. It never was. The next morning, the attic door was wide open, and that familiar sense of dread filled my chest again. Something had come out of that attic. Something had been watching me, waiting. And no matter how many years passed, that feeling never left. The morning after the terrifying experience in the hallway, I found myself standing at the bottom of the stairs that led to the attic, staring up at the small door that seemed to have grown even more menacing in the daylight. The feeling that had gripped me during the night hadn't loosened its hold. It lingered, hanging in the air like the last remnants of a nightmare. The attic door was wide open, just as it had been the night before. I hadn't imagined it, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that something had been up there with me, watching, waiting. As I stood there, a knot formed in my stomach. How could I have not heard anything? How could I not have felt the shift in the air? My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. I had always believed that things like this, these feelings of dread, of being watched, were just products of my overactive imagination, remnants of a childhood mind too eager to fear the unknown. But now, in the cold light of day, I knew better. There was something in that attic, something that had been with me for far too long. I turned away from the stairs, trying to calm myself. My brothers were still asleep, oblivious to the terror that had consumed me. They always seemed to come and go, slipping in and out of the house at odd hours, but never acknowledging the strange things that happened in that old home. Perhaps it was easier for them to ignore it, to push it out of their minds. I wanted to be like them, strong, unaffected, but I wasn't. The memories of the footsteps in the hallway, the unrelenting pressure on my shoulders, wouldn't let me be. It had happened before, and now it seemed like it was happening again. My mother had always been my safety net, the one person who could make everything seem okay. I could still feel the warmth of her arms around me, the gentle reassurance she gave when I'd run to her in fear. But even her presence hadn't been enough to erase the lingering sense of something unnatural in that house, something that didn't belong. That morning, as I passed by the open attic door again, I felt the weight of it all over again. The house wasn't just old and creaky, it was alive in ways I couldn't explain. Back in the condo, my wife tried to soothe my anxiety, but she too was unnerved. The fear that had initially seemed like nothing more than an odd occurrence in the attic had now become something larger, something we couldn't shake. As much as I wanted to believe that there was an innocent explanation for it all, I knew deep down that the open door, the heavy feeling that followed us through every room, wasn't something we could just brush aside. The night before, I had tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a draft, maybe. But now, standing in the middle of our condo, I realized it had never been just a draft. The unease was real. The more I thought about the attic in the condo, the more I felt like it was a mirror to my childhood fears. It wasn't just the physical space of the attic that unsettled me. It was what it represented. The darkness, the unknown, the feeling that there was something beyond the door, waiting. In the same way, the footsteps in the hallway as a child had once chased me into my mother's room. The open door in the condo now seemed to beckon me, forcing me to confront what had been hidden for so long. I walked toward the bedroom once more, but my mind was elsewhere. The attic in the condo, the one I had dismissed as an isolated event, was beginning to feel like it was part of something larger, something I had been running from my entire life. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't invited it into my life, yet here it was, both then and now, with no way to explain it. The fear that had once lived in the shadows of my childhood had grown. It had followed me, and now it was here again. The door was still ajar, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever was behind it wasn't done with me yet. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and anxious mornings. No matter how much I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, it clung to me like a second skin. The police had found nothing in the attic, just as they had the first time. They told us to relax, that it was likely nothing more than a malfunctioning door. But every time I looked up at that small, slightly ajar entrance, I couldn't believe it. It wasn't just a malfunction. Something was there, something unseen that refused to let go of me. My wife could sense the change in me, the way I had started to withdraw, lost in my thoughts, staring at the door as though waiting for it to open wider, to reveal whatever dark thing was hiding inside. She tried to comfort me, tried to tell me that it was just my imagination running wild, but I knew it wasn't. The door wasn't just open. It was inviting something in. I could feel it. I had felt it before, in that old house, and now it was here, in the condo, just as strong and just as menacing. I spent more time than I should have staring at that door, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps in the hallway, the way they had echoed through the house when no one else was awake. How the coldness in the basement had wrapped around me, suffocating me with its silence. I couldn't escape the sense of being followed, of being watched from the shadows. It felt like the past was clawing its way into the present, dragging me back to that place I had tried so hard to leave behind. The mystery of the attic had consumed me. I couldn't let go of the idea that something was in there, something that had followed me from my childhood, from that old house. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if the strange occurrences had ever truly stopped. What if it hadn't been a phase, or just my imagination? What if something had been lurking in the darkness all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again? One evening, as I walked past the master bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. There it was, that damn door, still open, just slightly, just enough to make my skin crawl. I felt the same oppressive presence that I had felt so many times before, in that house, in the hallway, in the attic. It was here again, in this condo, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I walked toward it, my steps heavy, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I don't know how long I stood there just staring at the gap, but when I finally turned to leave, I realized that my wife was standing behind me, watching silently. I didn't need to say anything. She knew. We both knew. The mystery of the attic wasn't something that could be solved. It wasn't about finding a logical explanation or calling the police for answers. It was about the lingering feeling that something was watching, something waiting. And in that moment, I understood that it was never going to leave. No matter how much I tried to fight it, no matter how much I wanted to forget it, the fear was always going to be there. I walked away from the door, back into the living room, where the weight of the silence pressed down on me. I knew that the question would never be answered. There would be no satisfying conclusion to this. No moment of clarity. The attic, the footsteps, the coldness, they were all pieces of something bigger, something I couldn't control. And as the days passed, I came to accept that. Some mysteries, some fears, are just meant to remain unsolved.